The morning mist clung to the pines like the ghosts of forgotten prayers when Thomas Mackenzie first laid eyes on the man who would change everything. It was the autumn of 1873, and the lumber camp outside Deadwood was bustling with the sounds of axes biting into timber and saws singing their metallic songs. Thomas had been working these Dakota Territory forests for nigh on 15 years, ever since consumption took his beloved Mary and left him with nothing but calloused hands and a heart carved hollow as a lightning-struck oak. The other men in camp knew him as a quiet sort, one who kept to himself and worked harder than two men half his age. They respected the way he could drop 100-foot pine exactly where he wanted it, and they'd learned not to ask about the worn daguerreotype he kept wrapped in oilcloth in his breast pocket. The stranger came stumbling through the morning fog like a man fleeing the very hounds of hell. His clothes were torn and mud-stained, his face gaunt with the kind of exhaustion that comes from running on nothing but fear and desperation for days on end. Blood had dried in dark patches on his shirt, and his eyes held that wild look Thomas had seen before in men who'd stared too long into the abyss and found something staring back. The camp foreman, Big Jim Patterson, was the first to spot the newcomer, and his hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip. In these parts, a man running usually meant trouble wasn't far behind. The stranger collapsed near the cook fire, his chest heaving like a bellows. Cookie, the camp's one-eyed cook, brought him water and hardtack, but the man's hands shook so badly he could barely lift the tin cup to his lips. It was then that he spoke those words that would haunt Thomas Mackenzie for the rest of his days. His voice cracked like kindling as he looked up at the circle of rough men surrounding him, and through his tears he cried out, "I buried my baby with my own hands." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and every man there felt something cold crawl up his spine. Thomas, who had been sharpening his axe nearby, slowly removed his hat, and the gesture was followed by every other man in the camp. In the wilderness, a man's grief was sacred territory, no matter what sins might have brought him there. The stranger's name was Samuel Hartwell, and as the days passed, his story came out in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that reflected nothing but pain. He'd been a farmer down in Kansas, trying to make a go of it with his young wife, Rebecca, and their infant daughter, little Sarah. The drought of '72 had been brutal, turning their wheat fields to dust and their dreams to ash. When the bank came calling, Samuel had nothing left to give but promises, and bankers didn't trade in hope. They'd lost the farm, lost everything, and had been heading west in a wagon with all their earthly possessions when the Comanche found them. Samuel spoke of that day with the detached voice of a man recounting someone else's nightmare. How the war party had come at them from the setting sun, their painted faces terrible in the dying light. How Rebecca had clutched little Sarah to her breast as Samuel reached for his rifle. How the sound of that child's crying had cut through the war whoops like a knife through his soul. He'd fought like a madman, killing 3 braves before a lance pierced his shoulder and a war club sent him tumbling into darkness. When he came to, the wagon was burning, and Rebecca lay sprawled in the dirt with her scalp torn away. But it was the baby he couldn't stop talking about, little Sarah with her mother's green eyes and her tiny fists that had always reached for him when he came in from the fields. The Comanche had taken the child, as was their way with the young ones. Samuel had followed their trail for 5 days, staying hidden, watching from ridgelines as they moved north toward the Badlands. On the 6th day, he saw his chance when the war party made camp near a creek bottom. The baby had been crying all day, refusing the corn mash the Indian women tried to feed her, and Samuel could see that patience was wearing thin. That night, he crept into their camp like death itself, moving between their sleeping forms with his knife gleaming in the starlight. He found Sarah in a cradle board next to an old squaw, and when he reached for his daughter, the woman's eyes opened. What happened next, Samuel told only to Thomas, and only after they'd shared a bottle of whiskey that Cookie kept hidden for emergencies. The old squaw had looked at him with eyes full of understanding rather than fear, and she'd nodded once before turning away. Samuel took his baby girl and ran into the night, but by then the fever had taken hold of her small body. For 2 days he'd carried her through the wilderness, trying everything he knew to break the fever, talking to her constantly, telling her stories of the farm they'd lost and the life they'd built somewhere new. But on the 3rd morning, as dawn painted the eastern sky the color of fresh blood, little Sarah had drawn her last breath in his arms. Samuel had buried her himself on a hillside overlooking a valley where wildflowers grew thick as stars. He'd carved her name into a piece of pine bark with his knife and sang the lullabies Rebecca used to sing, his voice echoing off the empty hills. Then he'd walked away from that lonely grave and into madness, wandering the wilderness for weeks until he'd stumbled into their camp half dead and wholly broken. The men listened to his tale with the solemn attention they'd give to a preacher speaking of Judgment Day, and when he was finished, they sat in silence as the fire crackled between them. Thomas Mackenzie found himself drawn to Samuel Hartwell in a way he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was recognition of a kindred spirit, another man hollowed out by loss and trying to find meaning in the simple act of keeping on. Perhaps it was the way Samuel worked, throwing himself into the back-breaking labor of felling trees as if he could chop down his memories along with the timber. The man had strong hands and a good eye, and he learned quickly how to read the grain of the wood and judge where a tree would fall. But more than that, he had the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his ghosts, and Thomas understood that particular dance better than most. As the weeks turned to months, the two men developed an easy friendship built on shared silences and the rhythm of honest work. They'd wake before dawn, share coffee that could float a horseshoe, and head into the forest, where the only sounds were the bite of steel into wood and the whisper of wind through the branches. Samuel never spoke of his family during working hours, but sometimes in the evenings, when the whiskey loosened his tongue and the fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, he'd tell stories of Rebecca's laugh or the way little Sarah would grab his finger with her tiny hand. Thomas would listen and nod and sometimes share his own memories of Mary, of how she'd hum while she cooked and how she'd always known when a storm was coming by the ache in her bones. The winter of '73 was harder than most, with snow falling so thick and fast that the men could barely see from the bunkhouse to the mess hall. Work slowed to a crawl, and the isolation began to wear on everyone's nerves. Men who'd been friends for years suddenly found themselves arguing over nothing, and more than once Big Jim had to step between campmates with his fists raised. Samuel seemed to handle the confinement worse than most, pacing the cramped quarters like a caged wolf and muttering to himself in the dark hours before dawn. Thomas worried about him, could see the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, could hear him crying out in his sleep as nightmares chased him through the long winter nights. It was during one of those endless February blizzards that Samuel finally broke. Thomas woke to find the man's bunk empty and his coat gone from the peg by the door. He dressed quickly and followed Samuel's tracks through the knee-deep snow, his lantern casting wild shadows that danced like demons in the wind. He found Samuel kneeling in a clearing about a quarter-mile from camp, his bare hands clawing at the frozen ground while tears froze on his cheeks. He was trying to dig, trying to scratch through earth hard as iron, while the snow fell around him like judgment. Thomas approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle as spring rain. "Samuel," he said, "what are you doing out here, friend?" Samuel looked up at him with eyes that held no recognition, no awareness of where he was or what he was doing. "I have to dig," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I have to dig her up and make sure she's still there. What if the wolves got her? What if she's cold?" Thomas felt his heart break for this tortured soul, and he gently took Samuel's bloody hands in his own, helping him to his feet. "She's at peace, Samuel," he said. "Your little girl is at peace, and she knows you loved her. That's enough. That has to be enough. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch even Samuel's wounded spirit. The ice broke on the streams with sounds like cannon fire, and the first green shoots began to push through the muddy earth. Samuel threw himself into the work with renewed vigor, as if he could somehow build a bridge across his grief with sweat and determination. He and Thomas worked side by side, dropping trees that had stood since before the first white men set foot in the territory, and in the rhythm of their labor they found something like peace. It was in late May when the riders came, appearing out of the morning mist like harbingers of judgment. There were 5 of them, hard men with guns worn low and eyes that had seen too much killing. Their leader was a tall drink of water with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made smart men step aside. They were looking for Samuel Hartwell, he said, and they had business with him that couldn't wait. Big Jim stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, and asked what kind of business might bring armed men to a lumber camp. The scarred man smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold promise of violence. Samuel had murdered those Comanche, the man explained, killed them in their sleep like a coward, and the territorial government had put a price on his head. Dead or alive, it didn't matter much to them, but they figured a man who'd kill sleeping Indians wouldn't think twice about killing white folks if the mood struck him. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water as he listened, not because he was afraid of these bounty hunters, but because he could see the resignation in Samuel's eyes, the way his shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled upon them. Samuel stepped forward, his hands held away from his sides, and nodded once to the scarred man. "I'm Samuel Hartwell," he said quietly, "and I ain't running any more." What followed happened so fast that Thomas barely had time to register the movement. Samuel's hand dropped to his gun, but the scarred man was faster, his Colt clearing leather like lightning while Samuel's weapon was still rising. The shot echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder, and Samuel staggered backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees in the muddy campground, his gun tumbling from nerveless fingers, and looked up at Thomas with eyes that held something like relief. "Tell them," he whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Tell them I buried my baby with my own hands, and I loved her more than life itself." Thomas caught Samuel as he fell, cradling the dying man's head in his lap while his lifeblood soaked into the earth. The bounty hunters stood watching with professional detachment, already calculating their payment and planning their journey back to town. Samuel's breathing grew shallow and ragged, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas's face with desperate intensity. "She's waiting for me," he whispered, and Thomas nodded, understanding. "She's waiting," Thomas agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of them are waiting for you, friend. Your Rebecca and your little Sarah. They're waiting to welcome you home." Samuel Hartwell died as the sun reached its zenith, passing from this world with a smile on his lips and his friend's hand in his. Thomas closed the dead man's eyes and sat with him for a long time, ignoring the bounty hunters and their impatient muttering about collecting their blood money. When he finally stood, his knees creaking like old leather, he looked at the scarred man with eyes that held 40 years of hard living and asked quietly, "What now?" The bounty hunter shrugged and holstered his weapon. "Now we take the body back to Deadwood and collect our fee," he said. "Nothing personal, you understand, just business." But Thomas Mackenzie had other ideas. That night, while the bounty hunters slept off their whiskey in the camp's spare bunks, he and Big Jim and Cookie dug a grave on the hill overlooking the valley, where Samuel had found some measure of peace during his final months. They wrapped him in his blanket and lowered him gently into the earth, and Thomas spoke words over his friend that came from the heart rather than any prayer book. He told the assembled men about Samuel's love for his family, about the courage it took to follow his daughter into Comanche territory, about the grief that had driven him to desperate acts and finally to redemption through honest labor and friendship. When the bounty hunters woke to find an empty grave and their quarry long buried, they flew into a rage that shook the very timbers of the mess hall. The scarred man drew his gun on Thomas and demanded to know where they'd hidden the body, but Thomas just looked at him with the calm that comes from having nothing left to lose. "That man has been through enough," he said quietly. "He paid his debts in full, and now he's at peace. You'll have to settle for an empty grave and the knowledge that justice was served in its own way." The bounty hunter raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Big Jim and the other men stepped forward as one, their own guns drawn and ready. After a long moment that stretched like eternity, the scarred man holstered his Colt and spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled, but they all knew it was. The bounty hunters left that morning, riding away with empty hands and murderous hearts. But they never came back. Perhaps they found easier prey elsewhere, or perhaps they decided that some fights weren't worth the cost. The lumber camp went back to its routine of dawn to dusk labor, but something had changed in the men who'd known Samuel Hartwell. They worked with a new respect for the weight that some folks carried, and they were quicker to offer a helping hand to those who struggled under burdens too heavy for one man to bear alone. Thomas continued his work in the forest, but now when he felled a tree, he thought not just of Mary waiting for him beyond the veil, but of Samuel reunited with his Rebecca and little Sarah, their family whole again in whatever realm awaited those who'd loved truly and grieved deeply. Years passed, and the lumber camp eventually played out, the easily accessible timber harvested and shipped east to build the growing cities of an expanding nation. Thomas Mackenzie moved on, as men did in those days, following the work and the promise of wages from one camp to another. But he never forgot Samuel Hartwell, or the words that had introduced him to their circle, and sometimes, when he was alone in the forest, with only the whisper of wind through the branches for company, he could swear he heard an echo of that broken voice crying out across the years. "I buried my baby with my own hands," the voice would say, and Thomas would remove his hat and bow his head in remembrance of a friend who'd found peace at last after carrying more sorrow than any one man should have to bear. The story of Samuel Hartwell became legend around the lumber camps and mining towns of the Dakota Territory. Men would tell it around campfires on cold nights when the wind howled through the trees and reminded them all of their own mortality. They'd speak of the farmer who'd lost everything to drought and violence, who'd tracked his stolen daughter across hostile territory, and who'd faced his final moments with courage and dignity. Some versions of the tale made Samuel into a hero, others painted him as a villain. But Thomas Mackenzie knew the truth was more complicated than either version allowed. Samuel had been a man, nothing more and nothing less, who'd loved his family with a fierce devotion and who'd made choices that haunted him to his dying day. In the end, Thomas reflected as he grew old and felt his own time approaching, that was perhaps the most human thing of all, to love so deeply that loss became unbearable, to make mistakes in the name of that love, and to search for redemption in whatever form it might take. Samuel Hartwell had found his redemption in honest work and friendship, in the simple act of being useful to his fellow man during his final months on earth. He died with his sins forgiven, if not by the law, then by something higher, and he'd left behind men who were better for having known him. That was a legacy worth having, Thomas thought, and when his own time came to cross over and join Mary in whatever lay beyond, he hoped someone might speak as kindly of him as he now spoke of Samuel. The lumber camps are gone now, swallowed by time and progress, and the forests where Thomas Mackenzie and Samuel Hartwell once worked have grown back thick and wild. But somewhere in those hills, if you know where to look and listen with your heart rather than your ears, you might still hear the echo of an axe biting into pine, or the voice of a broken man finding peace in the fellowship of those who understood that every soul carries its own particular weight of sorrow. And if you're very lucky and very quiet, you might even hear the whisper of a lullaby carried on the wind, sung by a father to his sleeping daughter as the years roll by like water over stone, washing all wounds clean at last. Thomas Mackenzie lived another 20 years after Samuel's passing, moving from camp to camp across the Western Territories as the great forests fell before the advance of civilization. He carried with him always the memory of his friend and the lessons learned in those months they'd worked side by side. In Montana, he met a young logger named Jacob, who reminded him so much of Samuel that it took his breath away, and Thomas took the boy under his wing, teaching him not just how to read the grain of timber and judge the fall of a tree, but how to carry grief without letting it destroy you. In Colorado, he helped establish a camp that became known for taking in men who'd lost their way, men fleeing their own demons and looking for honest work and a second chance at redemption. Wherever Thomas went, he told Samuel's story, but he told it carefully, with the reverence due to a man who'd paid the ultimate price for love. He never spoke of the bounty hunters or the price on Samuel's head, focusing instead on the love of a father for his child and the courage it took to keep living when everything worth living for had been taken away. The story spread through the camps and settlements like ripples on still water, changing with each telling, but always keeping at its heart the image of a broken man finding peace in honest work and the fellowship of those who understood his pain. There were nights, especially in winter, when the wind howled through the mountains like the voices of the lost, when Thomas would dream of that hillside grave where Samuel lay sleeping. In his dreams, he could see Rebekah and little Sarah waiting there, their spirits glowing like candle flames in the darkness, and Samuel rising from his earthly rest to join them in whatever paradise awaited souls who'd loved truly and suffered greatly. These dreams brought Thomas comfort in his declining years, assurance that death was not an ending, but a doorway, and that all the partings of this life were temporary things compared to the eternal reunions that waited beyond the veil. When Thomas's own time came, it was in a logging accident outside Missoula in the spring of 1894. A widow-maker, they called it, a dead branch high in the crown of a Douglas fir that chose that moment to let go and fall like the judgment of God. Thomas saw it coming, had time enough to step aside and save himself, but there was a young man working nearby, someone's son, who'd never learned to duck fast enough. Thomas threw himself forward, pushing the boy clear, and took the full weight of that falling timber across his back and skull. They said later he died instantly, that he never felt any pain, and maybe that was true. But those who were there swore they heard him speak just before the end, his voice clear and strong, despite the blood flowing from his ears. "I'm coming, Mary," he said. "I'm coming home at last." They buried Thomas Mackenzie on a hill overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, and it seemed fitting somehow that wildflowers grew thick around his grave, just as they had around little Sarah's final resting place all those years ago in the Dakota Territory. The men from his camp carved his name into a granite stone and added words that captured the essence of the man they'd known and respected. Thomas Mackenzie, friend to all who carried heavy burdens. Below that, they carved the image of a pine tree, its branches reaching toward heaven, and those who knew him best understood that it represented not just his life's work, but his belief that growth could come from even the deepest soil of sorrow. The years rolled on, and the great age of logging passed into history, replaced by machines and methods that Samuel and Thomas would never have recognized. The camps where they'd worked became ghost towns, their buildings weathering away until only stone foundations remained to mark where men had lived and worked and dreamed of better days. But the stories lived on, passed down through families and around campfires, growing richer with each telling until they became part of the great mythology of the American West. Samuel Hartwell, the farmer who'd buried his baby with his own hands and found redemption in the fellowship of working men. Thomas Mackenzie, the widowed lumberjack who'd shown that kindness to strangers was the highest virtue a man could possess. In the modern world, where grief is something to be medicated away and loss is something to be gotten over as quickly as possible, these old stories might seem quaint or outdated, but those who've loved deeply and lost greatly know better. They understand that some sorrows are too sacred to be hurried, that healing comes not from forgetting, but from finding meaning in the midst of pain. Samuel Hartwell never got over the loss of his family, never stopped hearing his baby's cry on the wind or seeing his wife's face in every sunset. But he learned to carry that grief without letting it destroy him, learned that work and friendship could provide a kind of salvation even when redemption seemed impossible. Thomas Mackenzie, for his part, never forgot his beloved Mary or stopped missing the life they might have built together. But he discovered that love doesn't end with death, that the capacity for caring can expand to embrace not just the memory of what was lost, but the hope of what might yet be found. In Samuel, he found a kindred spirit, someone else who understood that the deepest love often comes wrapped in the deepest sorrow. Their friendship became a testament to the idea that we're not meant to carry our burdens alone, that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person is simply the willingness to sit with them in their darkness and remind them that dawn will come again. The hills where they worked still stand, though the trees they felled have been replaced by new growth that reaches toward the same sky their axes once claimed. Sometimes, if you know where to look, you can still find the old campsites marked by rusty nails and broken bottles, and the stone foundations of buildings that once housed men far from home and family. And sometimes, in the whisper of wind through pine boughs or the distant sound of water over stone, you might hear something that sounds almost like voices, like the echoes of men who understood that life's greatest victories aren't measured in gold or glory, but in the simple act of helping another soul find peace. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, redemption, and the human spirit in America's frontier days. And in the comments below, tell us about a time when you showed kindness to a stranger who was carrying a heavy burden. Sometimes a simple act of compassion can change everything, just like Thomas Mackenzie's friendship changed Samuel Hartwell's final days. What unexpected friendship or act of kindness has shaped your own life? Share your story with us, and let's keep the spirit of the Old West alive through our own acts of courage and compassion.